everybody, welcome to Pro Wrestling Musings. I am Griff from GA, and we are joined today by a very special guest, a man who knows more about the Hangman Page storyline in AEW than anyone else in the world. That is not an exaggeration. It is Chris Brosnahan. You can find him on Twitter. He's a filmmaker, he's a writer, and like I said, the man's artistic ability is without equal. You will see that as we talk today. But the reason why we want to talk about this is because of Hangman Page's return on Dynamite. There's a lot of new fans of AEW that are not familiar with the Hangman storyline from the beginning. A lot of people that came in with Bryan Danielson and CM Punk that may not be familiar about the nuances of this Hangman storyline. And so you may be wondering, why are people so invested in this? Why do people care so much about this? Well, Chris is here to break it down for us. Chris, you have right now one of the most well-trafficked threads on Twitter over the last week or so talking about the Hangman Page storyline. So I want to go into a little bit of detail here, but before we get into that, I want you, we were just talking about how long you've been a wrestling fan. Almost 3 decades now you've been a wrestling fan. How different is this storyline from any that you have seen before in your time watching pro wrestling?
Hi, yeah, and hi everyone. Yeah, it is different, yes, but in some ways it's also harkening back to some of the older stuff too. I started watching wrestling in 1992, so that was in the build-up to WrestleMania 8, and it was kind of famous at the time that WWE would book WrestleMania the following year and start booking backwards throughout the year. So they used to do this longer-term storytelling that would be building up to the big payoff. And I think, over the almost 30 years, and God, I feel old, but over the last 30 years, WWE has moved away from that. And I think AEW has taken that, combined it with some of what was happening in Japan. So, it ties into the Kenny Omega and Kota Ibushi story and things like that. But it's basically staying true to character, building towards an end goal, and letting people interact. So the way they've done it and how they've used different types of media, that's been unlike anything else. And it's allowed for a really deep understanding of the characters and connecting with the characters, I think, in a different way. So, 28 years, I'm really excited and passionate about this story, and it's become one of my favorite ones in that entire time.
Well, it's such an interesting thing that you bring up as well, that I think a lot of people, especially if you're someone that watched Daniel Bryan, CM Punk in WWE in say the early 2010s, where this idea of multimedia storytelling in wrestling, that it wasn't really a thing. You watched wrestling and you got all the story that you wanted from the wrestling TV that you watched, and then the next week you'd show up and that story was in the exact same place. This particular story with the Elite, this encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses Twitter, it encompasses being the Elite, it encompasses their time in companies before AEW even existed. So this is a lot different than a lot of the great stories that we would think about in the past. But from what you're saying, that difference, those things that they now do differently, actually really helps this story grow dynamically, as opposed to just seeing it on Dynamite, week after week.
Definitely. And in a bunch of ways, it's kind of classic old-fashioned storytelling. It's kind of pretending that, it's taking the approach that this is real, the characters are real, what they want and their goals matter and are important. So as they change and as they interact, that kind of builds into their character and builds into their reasons for eventually wanting to fight each other and overcome obstacles.
It's really interesting, and we'll get into a lot of the details of that. But let's go to the very beginning of this story. This is all the way back at the formation of AEW, and even going before that. What were the origins of this Hangman Page character? How did he come to be the character that we now see on screen?
So it goes back to Japan, and I know that immediately sounds what we describe in the UK as a really wanky approach to saying things, but it's basically it goes back to Japan because the whole point behind Hangman Adam Page is that he doesn't feel he compares to his peers, and he got brought into this group who have become some of the greatest wrestlers in the business today, certainly most successful. So he's brought into a group with the likes of AJ Styles, with the likes of Finn Balor, with the likes of Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, and so on. And he's the guy that doesn't have the level of success that the others have. And he feels it enormously. And he feels that underneath it all, they believe this. And so back in Japan, he was kind of the new guy. And he's sort of wide-eyed, and he's sort of in with the bad lot. There's a lovely clip of, in NJPW, Tanahashi, he actually saying in advance of all of this, it's like, Hangman Page, he's different. Give him to me. I'll bring him out of the darkness that Bullet Club has him under. And all of that stuff is really cool. So you have this guy who's not standing out to the same level, not connecting with fans to the same level as well. People like him, but they love or hate the Young Bucks. They love or hate Kenny Omega, Cody Rhodes, etc., etc. So they start forming into the Bullet Club and into the Elite. And Hangman Page is there and he's part of it. But you constantly have this idea that he's anxious underneath it all as well. And he's kind of the good kid that's tagged along with a bad group almost.
It's interesting that you mention what the Bullet Club was. It's funny, if you go back and if you were to watch videos from around the formation of AEW, there's videos from places like What Culture and Cultaholic and places like that do these videos about, who's going to be AEW's biggest stars from the very beginning of AEW. And what's funny is that Hangman Page is rarely mentioned in the upper echelon of superstars from the beginning of AEW because he really wasn't viewed that way in Japan. He was very much the young gun of the Bullet Club.
The young gun, and to a certain extent, their friend that had tagged along.
Right.
And, it's obvious that AEW, right from the start, Tony Khan and the Bucks and Omega saw an enormous amount in him, because if you go back to that original clip where they're debuting the fact that AEW exists, and they announced Double or Nothing, and then AEW, it's Hangman holding the logo. They have him in there and right in the mix as one of the important people. And at that first pay-per-view, he's in the title match. And the reaction, I think, from a lot of people at the time, because I remember this as well, there was an element of, okay, that's a choice. It's like Jericho you expect, but I think a lot of people expected maybe Jericho and Omega or something like that. And, it wasn't a case of Hangman's a bad choice. He's just not at that level yet.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, people were somewhat assuming that Jericho was going to win because he was the bigger name coming in and they needed that to start off. And as good as the story was, people were into it, but they hadn't had much of a chance to be invested in Hangman Page yet.
What's funny is, this is where I come in as a wrestling fan, because I became a fan right at the formation of AEW, and I really liked Hangman Page from the very beginning. I really liked his character. I liked what he was about, his promos. I'm a big fan of Westerns, I really like Clint Eastwood Westerns and things like that. And so that really connected with me on that level. So it's funny that going into that, I actually felt like I knew more about Hangman than I knew about Chris Jericho. I actually had to go back and look at a lot of what Chris Jericho had done in order for me to learn about him. So it's one of those characters that I feel like if you knew who he was coming in, then, like you said, you're like, well, that's a choice. But if you didn't know who he was, if you were just getting involved, he actually was someone that stood out to you if you were a certain kind of fan, especially if you were a fan of Westerns. But looking back at it, you can definitely say that character did not have the sort of three-dimensionality the way that a Jericho did have, or that the way he has now.
I think you're right. And I think also it's the thing that didn't have the history. We had the history, even with the Young Bucks, with Omega and so on. They'd been pretty big names at this point. Hangman Adam Page he's clearly, he's a great looking guy. He's very talented. He speaks well, etc. He was clearly going to be a player. He was clearly going to be one of the upper level guys in the future. You kind of expect it around nowish or a bit earlier.
Right.
And so there was an element of, not quite that he was being set up to fail, but it was he was going to have a job cut out for him being in the main event for that first one. And again, I'm not downplaying him at all. It must have been really interesting coming to all this with all of the characters being new and not knowing the history. That kind of thing. That is really cool, and I'm quite envious. I really am. But it's also a lot of the fans that were watching, I think at the time, were probably more hardcore wrestling fans. They kind of the fandom that was there was people who were already on board.
Definitely.
So I think that's. But the thing is, they were playing that into it. When they kicked off AEW, there was a lot of conversation on Reddit, message boards, etc., about one of the things they'd said in hyping up AEW was that wins and losses are going to matter in this. And it was kind of treated a bit like, oh, it's going to be a total sports feel kind of thing by some people.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was hoping they meant by it, and I've been delighted that they have meant this, is that wins and losses are going to matter to the wrestlers. Mm-hmm. So what was really important for this, and what kicks off the storyline, isn't just that he loses, is that it's the losing breaks his confidence and breaks his heart, and he struggles as a result of it. Mm-hmm. And he's absolutely despondent.
Right.
And it takes a while for even him to realize that. Mm-hmm. But this idea that throughout it, and they've done a good job, I think. I mean, if you look currently at what's happening with Jon Moxley, the idea that he's clearly frustrated he's not in the title scene, he's getting angrier and more annoyed and more frustrated and possibly looking at turning heel. Mm-hmm. But it's the idea that the championships matter, the wins matter, the losses matter, and Page got this golden opportunity to be the guy on the first pay-per-view and loses. And on top of that, in kind of one of the things I talk about in the thread, an early detail for it, is that he asks the Young Bucks to be in his corner. Mm-hmm. Because the Bucks had been in the corner for Kenny Omega during his big matches. And, this was a big deal, Yeah. So
and I think
they do it in being the Elite, and they turn him down. And they don't turn him down full on. It's not like you suck. Mm-hmm. It's like they don't fully say no. They just don't say yes. They've got their own match to think about. They're kind of busy. And when it's not an enthusiastic yes, he kind of backtracks it and nobody talks about it again. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the setting the scene for everything that comes after that.
And I think what's important for people to know as well, you hear terms like the Elite and Bullet Club and things like that. It's easy to think, these are just names, these are just group names and things like that. And that's true. It's a group of people. But especially when you talk about the Elite, I mean, it's a name born out of a real thing that in Japan, they looked around, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks and Cody Rhodes, they looked around and they said, we really are some of the best wrestlers in the world, and we need to be treated like that. And if you watch any of Omega and the Bucks and Cody, you realize that, these guys are elite level wrestlers. And so to bring Hangman into that was a really interesting move from the beginning, because he wasn't on that level of, physical ability as a wrestler. And so from the very beginning, you always had this idea that Hangman didn't fit in with a group whose whole identity was being the best wrestlers in the world. And then they bring in this guy who's the Young Buck, no pun intended, but it's that idea that Hangman doesn't feel like he belongs in the group. Those seeds were planted from the very beginning.
Oh, definitely. And just quickly, there's one point in there as well. There's just in terms of the real life aspect as well. The idea that they're looking around going, we're some of the best in the world here. But also that if we band together, if we work together, we negotiate together, we agree that we're all going to go to the same place and work in the same place, that we can effectively launch a company off our backs. Mm-hmm. That took a lot of self-confidence. That took a lot of self-belief. That must have been so intoxicating to be around in real life as much as anything else. So being able to turn this into a story was fantastic.
and it took a lot of risk as well. I mean, again, if you're new to this, Kenny Omega was a massive star in New Japan. He was the world champion, the IWGP champion. He had some of the greatest matches of all time in that company, and he left, and it really damaged his reputation with the company to the point that, there was a lot of talk that if AEW had failed, Kenny Omega may not have a road back to go and perform in New Japan again. So this was a real risk that these guys took to create AEW. So that's, again, that sort of real life blending with the story.
Especially when NJPW were trying to start launching more in America as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was taken as something of a betrayal at the time.
Right.
But it's such an interesting time. And, at the time, a lot of people didn't think it would work out. A lot of people thought it was too much of a gamble. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, when you've got a group like this and you have, as you say, the young guy with them or the less experienced guy with them, to a certain extent, a lot of groups sometimes have that, and their job is to kind of take the pinfalls. Their job is to be the guy that loses.
Right.
It's a bit like currently at the moment, the super elite still have some of the guys in there who are more likely to get beaten up by everyone else. You still got Brandon Cutler and Michael Nakazawa there to kind of take the beating but protect the main guys.
Right.
But it's also, I think one of the things with Page is the idea that he had a lot of star quality. He was clearly going to be somebody. So it was always a case of, it's also protecting the future of the group. You don't just want the guys that are on top now and looking at AEW as a whole. You want to bring in the guys that are going to be on top for the next 10 years.
Right. So we have the basis, we have the groundwork that this story was built on, and now we move into Hangman coming into his own as a top-level player in All Elite Wrestling. And it wasn't as a world champion, because as you mentioned, he lost that world championship match against Chris Jericho, but rather he found himself teaming with Kenny Omega, and that whole story of them as a team was really the true foundations of what we're seeing right now as the Hangman Page storyline as it relates to Kenny Omega. So take us through how that story happened and what we saw the character go through as that story with him and Kenny Omega progressed.
Well, what you had with Kenny Omega and Hangman Adam Page, what you had with Hangman Page and Kenny Omega joining together was two characters that were in similar places. Because Kenny Omega had been brought in as the best in the world, and had then promptly mostly lost his early matches and lost almost every type of match. Mm-hmm. And he was also being introduced to an American audience that didn't know him that well. Mm-hmm. Right. Cody had a higher profile than him. Jericho had a higher profile. All anyone's heard is this guy was amazing in Japan. So he's there and he doesn't overwhelm. He is kind of slightly underperformed. I'm saying this as an enormous fan, but it's basically you have, and I know, I mean, in terms of, I was loving his matches and so on, but he wasn't being booked as the guy. He was being booked as, he's a bit of a disappointment. Yeah. In order that then Hangman Page is having a similar thing. The two of them work together and become this incredibly successful tag team who have a bunch of similarities and a bunch of differences. Right. Page is more tempestuous. Omega's more serene. Page drinks and enjoys partying. Omega disapproves of this. It's all this kind of stuff.
And I don't mean to put too fine a point on it, but speaking as someone, again, who came right at the beginning of all this, so I was learning about these characters for the first time, and I was also learning what other people thought about these characters at the same time. There was a lot of belief out there that Kenny Omega was not respected in New Japan the way that he might have been, or the way that a lot of people would like him to be. There was a feeling that he wasn't treated as the ace, the way that, a Hiroshi Tanahashi or a Kazuchika Okada had been. And so a lot of people were thinking, okay, well, now Omega is coming to AEW, and this is where he's going to be treated from moment one as the top guy, as, you know, the ace of the company. He's going to be positioned as, you know, the company's number one guy. And so it was a surprise from the off that Kenny Omega was not presented that way. And then to actually have it be the story that Kenny Omega isn't presented that way. I think for a lot of people, it immediately put a lot of people on the back foot and opened them up to new directions that this story could go in, which I think is why a lot of people were receptive to his teaming with Hangman.
And it was also completely the right call, because when Kenny Omega was in New Japan, you had him performing with incredibly experienced performers, with also some of the other best wrestlers in the world.
Right.
He's in there with Naito, he's in there with Tanahashi, he's in there with Okada, especially, because my God, Okada's amazing. Yep. So he's in there with guys who are already at his level. Coming into the US, I mean, arguably there was nobody at his level in outside maybe of some people in WWE at that point in time.
Right.
But just the idea that he wasn't going into New Japan where he was the outsider and they had the established guys. The job of AEW in the first 2 years was to start establishing other people. So if Kenny Omega was on top, who else are you building up? Whereas instead, he's helping cement Jon Moxley. He's helping make sure Jericho's in the right position. Yeah. He's putting over Pac. He's working with the Lucha Brothers. He's kind of helping other people build up, and then spending ages working in a tag team with Hangman Adam Page, helping him build up and portraying him on the same level, having amazing matches with FTR, amazing matches with the Young Bucks, and just anybody and everybody out there. And so it's Omega was always going to be portrayed as the guy. You just needed other people on that level for him to work with. So help doing that, taking that step down and working all these different types of matches, working with different people and helping build them up, means that when he does have his title run, you have people that now more people are invested in. And you have a tag team partner people are invested in, and a long-term nemesis that people want to see come back and lariat his head off.
Exactly. And we'll get to that. But I think what I want to spend a minute just talking about, again, for people that weren't watching AEW when this was going on, it was always being hinted at that Hangman and Kenny were not always on the same page. And it was, I think what was so impressive to me about the story is it wasn't done in a ham-fisted way. I hate to be that guy, but I mean, WWE is doing it right now, so it's a fair comparison. In WWE, you always have the can they coexist storyline, and it's two people that hate each other, but they're part of a tag team, and sometimes it does work. So I'm thinking like Cena and Shawn Michaels, or if you go back to ECW, you have someone like Rob Van Dam and Sabu or something like that. But very often it becomes just so grating because the story is shoved in your face all the time, and there's no subtlety to it. Whereas this, with Hangman and Kenny, there's a lot of subtlety to this. There's a lot of little things that people maybe didn't pick up if they didn't watch Being the Elite on YouTube, or if they didn't see these guys on Twitter or anything like that. But there was a lot of subtlety that would suggest that maybe these guys are not the perfect partnership the way the Young Bucks are presented, or the way the Lucha Brothers are presented, or the way FTR are presented. Hangman and Kenny were never really presented like that, and that helped move this story forward, even when these guys were winning championships and having these incredible matches.
Well, yeah, and you also have two parts of storytelling going that's on at the same time. You have the long-term storyline, which is bring this team together, and Kenny ends up kind of getting resentful of Hangman, and Hangman's insecurities eat him up. But you've also got the week-to-week aspect of, oh, they're not going to get on. Oh, they're bounced a little. Oh, no, actually, they're getting on better. And so you have this mini storyline in the middle of it of the two of them actually putting their differences aside and getting on the same page. And when you had the which match was it? The Super Bowl brawl or whatever it was called, the Stadium Stampede.
Stadium Stampede, yeah.
Yeah. So, they had the mini storyline in there of the two of them putting their differences aside, getting on the same page, and, working together. So emotionally, you're going from week to week. There's always something happening while you're building towards a long-term story. So you're not just hammering home the same thing every week until you eventually decide to do something with it. You know, we know they're not going to split up this week because they're beginning to work better together, but we know they'll end up splitting up. That was always going to happen. It was just a case of how.
It's and what it really created for people watching it is not the impending dread of, you know, okay, someone is, you know, Hangman's going to hit the buckshot lariat on Kenny or something right in the middle of a match. It was more of, you know, how was this going to happen? What is the emotional payoff going to be of these two splitting up, as opposed to, you know, someone's gonna turn on their partner in the middle of a match. And what was good about the work that these two guys were doing was that they really leaned into that. I mean, there were definitely times where, you know, Kenny would look at him like, I'm gonna snapdragon this guy right now, like in the middle of a match. Like, there was definitely those times where they hinted at it, and again goes back to a constant theme of this storyline, which is that these characters, even in the storyline, in the middle of what they're doing, know what we're thinking, and they play on that. They make reference to that.
And also, if it's your first time watching it, you don't need to know that. And that's really important, is they're not overcomplicating it and constantly having 3, 6, 9, 12 months of storyline in one match. There's also the basic level on the weekly show. You can watch it for the first time, and there's a note there you didn't quite get, but if you're interested, you'll go and find out.
Exactly. And where that really came out to me was their match, Hangman and Kenny versus the Young Bucks at Revolution 2020. And it was a fantastic match, just phenomenal on its own right. But the more you know, the more that match starts to mean, right? So I can show it to people that know nothing about Kenny Omega's history in Japan, and they will love it. But, you know, when I went back and learned about his history with Kota Ibushi, for example, and you see the golden trigger spot where Kenny kicks out at 1 and all that, like, it emotionally means more to you because you know it. But you don't need to know that in order for it to mean something, and that has been a strength of this story.
I think so, and it adds extra details if you're looking for them, but it's not getting in the way of the immediate story, which is this match.
Yeah,
you know, because they've clearly done something that's pissed him off, and he's got up at 1, and it's awesome. But if you know why, it adds more emotion to it as well.
Exactly. So as we go through this, these guys hold the tag titles for the better part of a year, and they finally lose them to FTR in a really, really good match. And at the end of it, you have this teased spot where Kenny is thinking about hitting Hangman with a chair and officially turning at that moment. He doesn't, and instead the story gets drawn out even longer. Will Kenny Omega turn heel? You know, what is Hangman going to do now? Is he going to return to the fold as a singles competitor? The commentators started making reference to this, and people, Tony Schiavone started asking Hangman, are you going to return to singles competition? What are you going to do now? He was asking the same thing of Kenny Omega. And so once again, we're presented with a fork in the road where AEW could have gone with the obvious, where Kenny hits Hangman with a chair, turns heel, and we ignite the feud between them. But instead, they've decided to go stretch out the story for even longer, and as a result now, the eventual payoff, which we're building up to, is going to be even more valuable. So can you take us through, right at the end of their time as a tag team, how that story then progressed to the next level?
There are 2 points to this. One of them is exactly what's happening in the ring, and one of them is the build up to it as well, especially on being the elite. And to be fair, one of the things that people pointed out about the thread that I did on Twitter about this was, but you have to be watching Being the Elite to get all of this. And it's like, if you have a look back through it, how many of the things on there were actually on Dynamite? You know, how many of the things on there were actually on the weekly show? They were supplementing it, but it was on the weekly show. But what they built up more than, or it was on the road to shows or things like that. But what they built up more than anything else was Hangman's desperation. He's lost his friends. He's been kicked out of the Elite. He's kind of betrayed the Young Bucks because he doesn't want to face them. And all of this is happening. And he is absolutely desperate to keep this more than anything else. And he's deluded himself into thinking it can be when emotionally Kenny's already out the door. But also on top of this, and quite a few people pointed this out to me, in most of their big matches, Hangman was the one that got the win. You know, Hangman's the guy that got the pins in most of their big tag team matches. So Omega's also kind of getting jealous of this guy and getting frustrated with him. You have the idea, again, he's gone from being the disappointing guy to the guy that's winning all the time, but he's also winning because of his tag team partner.
Right.
So he's now kind of getting more and more, no, this is all about me. And is getting annoyed with it, and he's getting frustrated and is beginning to blame it all on Hangman. So you get this perfect storm of Omega checking out and becoming selfish, Hangman desperate to maintain the relationship and friendship, and you just get that beautiful moment where Hangman's exhausted, collapses down, and Omega just lets him drop, looks at him disgusted, and walks away. And it's just as, you know, if there's one beat that kind of builds up all of that story, it's that moment. And it's not violent, it's not aggressive. It's just one guy who's given his all to keep it, and the other guy going, whatever. You know,
right.
It's fantastic.
The other guy moving on in that moment. So in the aftermath of that, what we get then is Kenny Omega immediately moving on and saying that, you know, the tag team stuff was great, but now I'm ready to go be a champion. And he was still doing this as a babyface, mind you. He's still a babyface. So the way he talks is still talking about, you know, I want to become champion. I want to fight the best. Doing this kind of thing where it's not so selfish and self-centered the way he would later become as a heel. But Hangman was not able to move on from the tag team in the aftermath. But we still get... go ahead.
Well, yes, I mean, yes, he's still technically being a babyface, but he's being this lousy, passive-aggressive, weird kind of approach. He's refusing. All of his compliments about Hangman are very measured and very careful. But he went out and had that hilarious match with Sonny Kiss where he won in one move, and then did the whole, that was an exhausting match, and just taking the piss. Right. And but in the meantime, you have he's acknowledging Hangman Page is a very talented tag team wrestler. And it would be that kind of phrasing, right, while also reminding everyone, I'm world championship material. My tag team partner was a very good tag team wrestler. So he's still being a babyface. He's not officially turned heel. But, by that point, I think people were already wanting to see Hangman kind of, beat him up in the next match. You wanted to see him kind of get angry about it rather than just... Actually, what's happening at that point in the story is Kenny Omega's words are hitting home to Hangman. Hangman's just feeling worse about himself hearing this and believing it. And so you end up with them in the title tournament where Omega wins. And a lot of people thought, and I thought, it's like, it's way too early to be doing this match. What are they doing? But it was actually just continuing this thing of Hangman doesn't believe he's on Kenny's level, and Kenny is desperate to make sure Hangman doesn't believe it.
It was at this point in the story that I think you really, like, we could do a whole other video just examining Kenny's heel turn, because it's so important. We talk all the time in wrestling that you can't be a heel anymore the way you used to, especially in AEW, because you have so many smart fans that they like you regardless of who your character is. So if they're cheering, whether you're a face or a heel, they like you. If they're booing, whether you're a face or a heel, that's go away heat. That's not real heat. I think what is so important to understand about this point in the storyline is not only does it represent a really big moment for Hangman, the moment where he starts to, in the hero's journey, he starts to reach that bottom point, right? He's starting to bottom out and he needs to re-examine himself. it not only means that for him, but for Kenny Omega, it represents the point where he starts to become a person that you genuinely dislike, right? He starts to become a real heel, his character. And we now have at the point where Kenny Omega, who at one point was this massive babyface, and people cheered him and they were so happy to have him here in the US and making, becoming a part of AEW, helping make that happen. He goes from that to now, if you watch Kenny Omega come out, he's getting booed more than almost any other character on the show. And it was right here that Kenny started to make that happen with the things he was saying and how he was treating people, especially Hangman.
And it's partly because, as an audience by this point, if you were following it especially, you just wanted Hangman to get a win. And I don't mean a pin. I mean in terms of you want him to get something that meant something to him, because you could, they'd done such a good job by this point of having him clearly believe all the negative stuff about himself. And you have the guy that he thought was his best friend needling him and just getting in at these emotional points. Mm-hmm. So the audience was Hangman was exactly the right guy to do this with, because you were desperate for him to win as well. And Omega's just, going exactly against this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't need to be full on heel yet, but because it doesn't matter, because you've got the baby face. Then you spend the next while building up the heel that he can go against and making him mean even more.
So now we get to the early part of the pandemic era. So we're talking, summer of 2020 into the winter of 2020. This is where the Dark Order starts to come into the Hangman storyline. And the Dark Order is important, I think, not so much from a match perspective. They didn't have a whole lot of matches together the way that you would expect. It was more important from the perspective of understanding where Hangman was at this point in his journey, how he viewed people, and really how low he had gone in the aftermath of his tag team with Kenny Omega. So help take us through how the Dark Order started to become a factor in Hangman and how that helped his character move forward.
It was actually really early on. It was kind of before the tag team really took off. It was before they brought Brody Lee in as well. You had the whole thing going on with the Dark Order doing the recruitment, and their videos were aimed at, basically losers. It's like, if you're a loser, the Dark Order will help you become a winner. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of shown in Being the Elite at some point. It was hinted at that Hangman had applied. And it never really went anywhere. It was clear that somebody had, and it was hinted at that it was Hangman. Mm-hmm. When Brody Lee was in and they kind of took the Dark Order in that direction, you get that kind of moment of him telling Brody Lee, it's like, hey, I actually apply to you guys and you never go back to me. Still, never mind, eh? And the Dark Order are furious. Or Brody Lee's furious, because it just turns out somebody didn't respond to his email. But it was also, that was what the Dark Order were about. They were the losers getting together in order to, be reborn and become winners back when it was a more, a darker cult. Right. And the Dark Order become just the funniest thing on Being the Elite every single week. They weren't always showing it on Dynamite. I mean, they've begun to over time, but they were just hilarious and immediately lovable. So when they go on the point of trying to befriend Hangman Adam Page, it's figuring out how they're going to work with this story. I think the original plan was changed because of Brody Lee's death. I'm pretty convinced the plan for that pandemic era was building up to a long-term Brody Lee, Adam Page feud. Because I think, that seemed to be the vague direction they were going in. Mm-hmm. And I always assumed it'd be kind of, if Hangman won, the Dark Order would be freed from Brody Lee. Unfortunately, we had the sudden and very sad death of Brody Lee, John Huber. So, they then take it in a completely different direction. And I think it slowed things down. I think a bunch of this has happened in a longer way than it was meant to, while they've kind of first of all gone, okay, what are we doing now? How are we fixing things for the time being?
Mm-hmm.
And also trying to figure out, okay, but how do we get back on track for the long term?
Right.
So you start getting this unusual but really fun story about friendship and about these guys just, at first they're trying to recruit Adam Page, but when they hang out with him and they see how low he's gotten, because I don't know if are you able to, is swearing okay on this video or not?
Yeah.
Cool. You get this great bit on Being the Elite where the Dark Order, who at that point hate him, are all chanting, fuck Hangman, fuck Hangman. And Hangman's just at his lowest point and drunk and wanders in and just enthusiastically joins in because his self-loathing and self-belief are so low. And he's leading the chant, fuck Hangman! But that's the point where the Dark Order suddenly go, oh, hey, this guy needs help. This guy's not doing great. And they go out to try and become his friend. And he can't accept that. And it's one of the nicest points. I'm going to jump ahead very quickly in real life to when I did that thread. Mm-hmm. Hangman Adam Page retweeted it at the time and I love this quote, "Don't you hate it when some asshole editorializes your life like you're a sideshow?" And it was perfectly in character because at that point in time, and for most of the previous year, Page couldn't accept a compliment because he didn't believe it. If anybody told him, hey, you're great, you could see him not believe it. Mm-hmm. So the Dark Order wanting to be his friend, on some elements, he doesn't get why they would want to, because he doesn't get why anyone would want to, because but you have that amazing promo just before he and Kenny Omega split up, where he talks about, outside I look like everyone else, but inside from head to toe, I'm poison. And he believes that everything that's gone wrong is because he's wrong inside, that it's down to him. And so he's rejecting anything positive coming towards him. And at this point, the Dark Order are just trying to support him and tell him that they want to be his friend. And he can't accept it. He can accept hanging out with them. He becomes friends with them. But it's why when eventually, the Dark Order stand up for him and go up against Kenny Omega and say, we know a guy that's on your level. Mm-hmm. You get that great response from Kenny Omega of, they never even mention his name. If you're talking about who I think you're talking about, even he doesn't believe he can beat me. And part of the reason Hangman's furious is because he doesn't at that point. Because he doesn't have this belief in himself. He believes he's this awful, awful person. Mm-hmm. And he slowly begins to accept their support and accept their friendship. And yeah, I've never seen a story like that in wrestling before. It was absolutely genuine and absolutely lovely.
Right, absolutely. And while this was going on, at the same time, because every great story needs a great hero and a great villain, so at the same time this is going on, Kenny Omega is in the business of completely shattering everything we thought we knew about pro wrestling. And it starts with him winning the world championship. So Jon Moxley is obviously a beloved world champion. Everyone has always loved Jon Moxley and appreciated him even more because he was a great world champion during the pandemic when he had no fans to work with. And it's always a difficult...
And wasn't he great?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know how much you saw of his days in WWE, but he was kind of an upper card guy. Mm-hmm. But you had this kind of famous story where he said, McMahon just doesn't think I have anything cool or interesting about me. He thinks I'm this weirdo, so he's booked as a weirdo. And in AEW, they booked him as the next coming of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he was awesome. Right. He just came across like the baddest person in the room. Anyway, exactly. Sorry, I wasn't meaning to sidetrack too much.
No. That's absolutely right. It's all important to know because anyone who beats that Jon Moxley character is not going to be accepted by the fans, certainly at that point. But the way that Kenny Omega does it, when he gets a microphone slipped to him by Don Callis, who at that point was brought in as just a guest commentator because he had been with Kenny Omega his whole career. He knew Kenny, and so, he was just an expert on Kenny Omega, and he was a very good commentator, so they brought him in for that. But he actually gets involved in the match, slips a microphone to Kenny. Kenny uses it to knock out Jon Moxley, win the title, and then, of course, Don Callis, while running away from whatever Jon Moxley was going to do to them when he woke up, they ran away from the arena, and of course Don Callis famously says, "You'll find out what happens on Tuesday," when Impact was going to air. And that moment really changed a lot of professional wrestling, because now you're saying the AEW World Champion is going to show up on Impact, and it was this huge moment. And so while Hangman is starting to, figure out how to let people back into his life, start to figure out, how am I going to have friends, and how am I going to, deal with my own personal issues, Kenny Omega is changing wrestling, breaking down the forbidden door and all of this. And so if you're new to AEW, you're going to see a lot of these people that don't work for AEW. You're going to hear references to the forbidden door and things like that. Kenny Omega is the one who started that in a lot of ways, in such a massive on-screen way. I mean, Jon Moxley was the IWGP US champion, so technically it was kind of already happening, but that was rarely ever talked about for him. But for Kenny Omega, that was a huge story, breaking the forbidden doors. So you have one guy who's changing wrestling, and the characters are making reference to that. They're constantly saying, only Kenny Omega could change wrestling like this. Only Kenny Omega could do this. So you have one character trending in that direction as this all-timer, and you have another character who's just struggling to even have friends again after what's happened. And so then that brings us into the point where Hangman re-enters the fold as a potential challenger for Kenny Omega's World Championship, skipping through a lot of Kenny Omega's title reign, which you should go back and watch because it's great. He has some great matches. But skipping through that to when Hangman re-enters the fold as a potential challenger.
On top of that, by the way, Kenny Omega is as obnoxious bad guy is just one of the funniest things on television.
It really is.
I find him consistently hilarious. But yeah, what was amazing about that was even then I was seeing a bunch of people online kind of talking about, oh, they've missed their moment. They missed their moments at the end of the tournament, and they missed their moment previously. They've left it too long. Nobody's going to care about Hangman going up against Kenny Omega. And all it took was that promo of the Dark Order coming out, and you had people just jumping up and down in excitement going, it's happening! It's happening! And so you get this kind of... At this point still, Page doesn't entirely believe in himself, but he believes in the Dark Order. He believes in his friends, and he's going out to fight for them more than he's going out to fight for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, they build up this, and just, it wasn't that long a build-up either. They built it up over, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks? And it was at an absolute fever pitch. And you end up with that 5-on-5 match. And I think everyone kind of thought they're now going, and that's going to be the bit that leads to him finally winning the match.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, personally, and this was when I did the thread, by the way. So this was back in July. I was kind of watching this, and a lot of me was going, oh, well, they wouldn't be doing this if they weren't about to pay it off.
Right.
But also where there were rumors about who else was coming in and where AEW was going. So it seemed like it must be the right time. But at the same time, there was part of me going, but it doesn't feel like Omega's been champion very long, and he's awesome right now. So on some levels, I kind of wish they'd leave it a bit longer, but screw it. If they're doing it, because I'm there for it. And then suddenly he loses and goes away for months. And you have this idea of one of the things that was great about that was he felt like he'd let down the Dark Order, which backed up a bunch of his self-belief things.
Mm-hmm.
He's begun to deal with them, but he's not healed yet. So him feeling like he's let down his new friends, that's heartbreaking for him. But the Dark Order feels like they screwed up and they let him down. So just for all of the good guys out of this, nobody comes out of this in a good way. Mm-hmm. The Dark Order are splitting up. They kind of end up spending the few months arguing with each other, and Hangman just goes away for a while. And on top of that, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega are obnoxiously celebrating the entire thing. So, and it was kind of amazing because while he was away, you then get CM Punk coming in, and what a moment that was. You
Right.
then get Adam Cole coming in. You then get Bryan Danielson coming in, and these are all huge deals. And again, I was seeing a lot of people kind of going, they missed the moment with Page, and with Page kind of taking the time off for family reasons as well. It was kind of like, well, it's a shame he's done this because that was the moment and they missed it.
Hmm.
I get why they changed it, but the landscape has changed now. So, are people going to care about him in the same way when he comes back?
Right. I think we have
And then
our
he came
answer.
back, and then he came back, and you had people, as somebody I saw described it, they can coming back and people throwing babies in the air in celebration. It was kind of, it was just immediately like, and again, you get this constant idea of, oh, are they getting this right? Have they missed the moment?
Hmm.
And he comes back and he's just a bigger deal than ever, and everyone's just like, yeah, no, totally on board. This is great.
Well,
We're right back there again.
it shows you on one hand that great storytelling, people are always going to remember that. I know we live in a world that moves so fast. We always talk about the 24-hour news cycle and all these things, and we feel like people forget, but great storytelling, people don't forget that. People want to see the beginning, middle, and end of great stories, and this has been a great story, so people are never going to be satisfied until we actually see the way this ends. But I think what's also very important is to talk about the 10-man tag with the Dark Order and the Elite, because that to me was the moment where that story turned from one of self-doubt and pity for Hangman to the point where now Hangman is going to be truly presented as a great world champion. Because you have to remember, the end, we talk about the end as being, him potentially dethroning Kenny Omega for the world champion, but in wrestling things always move forward, so that may be the end. But then you also have to have a world champion that people believe in, and to have a world champion you need to present someone as a competent, a true best wrestler in the world. And the way they did that is to take the self-doubt and the self-loathing that came with Hangman and turn it into one of his strengths. And I think a lot of people, if you don't watch westerns, you don't, I don't know if you really understand. I don't want to say that. I think you may have missed a lot of some of the subtlety that was going on in this story. And by that I mean, when you have that 10-man tag, the entrance for the Dark Order comes with this whole video package, which you can watch on YouTube right now, and I absolutely suggest you do. It's one of the best video packages that AEW has ever done, and it deals with the idea of how being a cowboy, it was all about, cowboys don't need to have hats, right? And being a cowboy is about being self-confident, but also allowing other people to have your back and doing that. And I think if you don't watch westerns, you don't realize that actually is the message of a lot of old westerns. We think about like Clint Eastwood, we think about the Lone Gunner, we think about things like that, we think about True Grit, and we think about that. And you think about a single person living on the front range, but a lot of those movies actually do have to do with, letting other people have your back, having other people, having other people's back. But at the end of the day, being confident enough in yourself that whether you're with other people or you're going it alone, you're still a strong character. You still are able to get on. And that's exactly what the Hangman Page story has been about. Understanding that it's not a sign of weakness to let other people in, and it's not a sign of weakness to need other people, as long as you know that when those other people are gone, you yourself are still capable of being a man and doing what you need to do. And that's what Hangman learned throughout this whole story, and that's what we learned during the 10-man tag. And now we're seeing a confident Hangman Page. We're seeing, and I always said it like this, I loved his character at the beginning because it is that old Western style character. But now, at that time, that character was presented as this is who he is, and just, take it for what it's worth, because this is what we're telling you. And now he's being presented as a similar character, but now he's earned it. He's earned the ability to act that way. He's earned the ability to be a badass, to come out on a horse and have this massive ovation from the fans. He's now earned that, as opposed to saying that's just who he is.
I completely agree. And on top of that, you got the bit. It was Colt Cabana in that fantastic 1 minute long segment with an amazing amount of storytelling, where the Dark Order kind of tell him he can do this, and you get that moment of it's okay to fail as long as you get back up,
Right.
and keep going. And so he overcomes both his fear of letting other people in which he doesn't join the Dark Order, but he goes in as equals with the Dark Order and kind of joins them to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
But also he loses, but it's not on fair terms. He's outnumbered, they cheat, and so he then goes away to kind of find himself. At this point, he's gotten a certain amount of the way. He needs to figure some stuff out and come back. And what he's also got from the match is now he's also learned, no, actually, I can do this. I am on this level. I have backup if I need it. So the elites can be taken care of. And he now just needs a clean match with Kenny Omega because he's been denied that. Well, the previous times he'd always lost. He's now at a level where he can win and might have won that 5-man tag if they hadn't cheated. So right. All of it together, you have his own belief in himself, you have his belief in others, and as you say, it's been earned, and it's been earned by overcoming his fear of failure. It's been earned by overcoming his fear of letting other people in.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, after all this, we're now here at what could be reaching the climax of this story. It's such an interesting thing. We talked about it on the Pro Wrestling Musings podcast, all the different ways that this could go, that this might end up. But regardless, it definitely feels like we are at the biggest inflection point of this story so far, as we get to what may be the climactic final match between him and Kenny Omega, potentially. I mean, there's lots of different ways it could go. But so, for you who's followed this story and has been so involved in this, looking back over 3 years of storytelling from these guys, what stands out to you the most about this story that people who are not familiar with AEW should know?
That it's mature storytelling. That this is not, I'm not going to say it's not wrestling because it's uniquely wrestling, but right, here's the thing is, wrestling fans have been, to the most part, kind of underestimated, I think. Part of the reason WWE for so long, would set up the episode at the start of the episode. Mm-hmm. It would be the first segments would be setting up the rest of the show and setting up the main event. And it was entirely on the basis that you can't really expect people to remember what happened previously. Or in a lot of ways, we got used to the idea that it didn't really matter what happened previously, mm-hmm. because nobody really cares. And there was a point, I'm going to, a very, very quick tangent here, but there's a reason for it. I remember when, I think it was Vince Gilligan talking about how they wrote elements of Breaking Bad. And what he said was that they knew the overall direction of it, but they didn't plan out every single thing in advance. Mm-hmm. Partly because you don't know if you're going to get another season, you don't know how long it's going to go. You know the rough idea and you have the overall shape of it, but you're going to figure out each bit as you get to it. So they would get the writing team in, and people would suggest things that they hadn't even thought of, but holy crap, we set up this 2 seasons ago and we can pay this off. And we'd all forgotten about it, but you can do this thing with the bell and that would be so cool. And, so, hopefully that still makes sense even if you haven't seen Breaking Bad. But you have this idea of, you've created... Sense, so. Cool. You have this idea of an overall framework you're building towards that you can still play around with inside and do callbacks and references, mm-hmm. and still do things that make sense. And, for that's premium television. And that's what we're talking about here, is the last couple of years of AEW, and particularly this storyline. I think it's been genuine kind of, premium television. I think it's been premium storytelling. It's been mature. I mean, it's been silly in places. Don't get me wrong. Of course it has. It's had Kenny Omega being an obnoxious dickhead and John Silver running around kicking people while Jim Ross shouts Johnny Youngie. But it's the idea that you can watch it week on week and still get most of it and still get a lot out of it. But if you want to dive into it to the point where somebody does this ridiculous Twitter thread explaining the history of it, there's enough there to justify it.
Mm-hmm.
And, the idea that they're confident enough to have done this, that it's not been planned out week by week from the start, but they've had the overall idea and stuck to it, I think that's phenomenal and is a real achievement that if they pay this off and they hit the landing, that's going to be something in years to come. People are going to go, wow, this was amazing stuff.
Right. People say that long-term storylines in wrestling are dead, that you can't do, Hulk versus Sting. You can't do Taz and Shane Douglas. Like you can't, or Taz and Sabu even. Like you can't do stuff like that anymore. And I think what we're learning with the help of the story is you can do long-term storyline. It's just different now than it used to be. It's not going to be one guy versus one guy for 18 months or however it is. But the idea of characterization, things that the fact that characters grow and develop and you see that happen, that can still happen. I mean, pro wrestling is storytelling at the end of the day. It's just different than any other kind of storytelling that exists out there. I always tell people, because I became a wrestling fan recently, a lot of people who knew me for my whole life, they say, why do you watch wrestling? What's the appeal? And I say, why do you watch serialized TV? It's the same thing. It's the same storytelling.
And also on top of that, it's basic storytelling, and that's not a bad thing.
No.
The basic storytelling of your classic wrestling match is more or less your 3-act structure of a story. Mm-hmm. You have your beginning, your middle, and the end. You have the good guy shows that he's better, the bad guy starts winning, and then you have however it ends.
Right.
So done right, a wrestling match is a story. And so you get this basic story in 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes or whatever. You also then get short-term feuds where you have a kickoff, like with MJF and what's his name? Brian Pillman Jr.
Yeah.
So we're just saying with that, you've got an immediate short-term. MJF comes off and runs his mouth. Pillman shows that he's more up to it than MJF thought, and then you go towards the end. You get your same basic structure. So as any base, so you have your short stories or your flash fictions in there, and this is the equivalent of a novel. It's the same basic structure, but there's so much more happening there. You get so much more in the build-up, so much more happening with the middle section where all of the challenges come in, and then you build up towards a resolution. So that's one of the things personally I love about wrestling is you're getting all of these stories that ideally intersect and work into each other and sometimes work into bigger storylines that contain subplots and everything else as well.
Well, that's why I was really excited to have you on today. You are the person who is most qualified to talk about that part of wrestling storylines that I've seen. So thank you so much for that. So before I let you go, I got to ask you one question here. Are we truly in the final act? Does this come down to Hangman Page beating Kenny Omega at Full Gear in less than a month to win the World Championship? Or is there any possibility that we might actually see this get drawn out a little further than that?
I think we're at the end. If I was betting on it, I'd bet on it. But at the same time, they've surprised me before by keeping it going longer than I thought they were going to, and it has still worked. If they keep it going, I think they'll make it work. However, the main reason why I think they're ready to do it now, as well as it's a great time for Page's storyline, it's also the company's at the right place for it. I think even 3 months ago, you would have struggled to have a bunch of people ready to go into feuds with Adam Page as champion. Mm-hmm. I think now you've got Malachi Black can be slotted straight into it. A current tweener verging on heel, John Moxley, who's pissed off, is ready to go into that. Mm-hmm. You've got a couple of top-level tweeners and heels that are ready for those short-term feuds that he's going to need to establish himself as champion.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I was booking it at the moment, it'd be Hangman winning, and the next feud would be with John Moxley.
I wouldn't say no to that at all, because there's two kind of similar characters in the sense of, being the loner out there, so to speak, but two guys who dealt with it much differently throughout their AEW run.
Totally. Oh, and don't forget Miro. I think Miro's on that level now as well.
Absolutely.
They've built up so many guys, and on top of that, I think at this point everyone needs Omega Danielson too.
Yeah.
But but that doesn't need the belt. That just needs to be about who's better. Mm-hmm. So you've got Omega ready to go into a feud that doesn't need the belt. It feels like the right time. I'm hoping it is because I'm enjoying it. If they manage to prove me wrong and stretch it out longer, more power to them. But yeah, this feels like the time. I'm ready to see. As I said in the thread, I'm ready to see Hangman Adam Page kick out of the one-winged angel and lariat Kenny Omega's head off. We're all ready for this. 2020 and 2021 were difficult times. Let's pay it off the right way.
No one's gonna argue with you here, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on and talking us through one of the most important, maybe the most important storyline that AEW has done to date, and one that I think you're right. If it's paid off correctly, it will go down as one of the great storylines in the history of pro wrestling. So thank you so much. And before you get out of here, if you would please tell the people where they can find you.
Oh yeah, I'm best place is probably I'm on Twitter at Chris Brosnahan. You can also find a bunch of my short stories and short films at chrisbrosnahan.com.
Definitely go do that. So if Chris has not convinced you so far that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to storytelling and can therefore make some good works of art, then I don't really know what you've been listening to for the last hour.
And thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for inviting me on and the time here. I've had a blast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Folks, follow us on Twitter at PW Musings for more as Hangman continues his run towards potentially becoming world champion. We'll have a lot more coverage of that. Thank you one more time to Chris Brosnahan. His Twitter will be below. Thank you all so much for joining us. Subscribe to the Pro Wrestling Musings YouTube channel. Check us out at ProWrestlingMusings.com. We really appreciate all of you.